What if a single law in a small African country could quietly rewrite the story of global economics? For decades, Africa's headlines have been filled with sorrow, famine, coups, debts, and disasters. People have grown so used to seeing the continent as a land of need, not of decision. Yet this time, something different happened. Something bold, simple, and deeply logical. Recently, the social media feeds of Africans everywhere, from Lagos to London, from Ouagadougou to Washington, were filled with a kind of good news that felt almost unreal. The government of Burkina Faso passed a new law stating that any company earning more than 5 billion CFA francs, about 8.8 million US dollars, must build its headquarters inside the country. At first glance, it sounds like some bureaucratic update, another policy few will notice. But when you look closer, you realize it's not just a law. It's a message, a declaration, a quiet revolution built not with protests or slogans, but with purpose. Because, for far too long, Africa has been the continent that gives while others take. The land offers gold, cotton, and ideas, yet the profits vanish overseas. The decisions that shape African lives are too often made in boardrooms thousands of miles away. And the people who work hardest rarely see the fruits of their own soil. But this law changes everything. It says, if you profit here, you belong here. It's not about punishment, it's about presence, about dignity, about finally taking a seat at the very table where Africa's wealth is created. Tonight, as we reflect on this moment, one question lingers in the air. Could this small, landlocked nation, Burkina Faso, be leading a movement that will redefine how the world does business with Africa? Because, perhaps for the first time in a long time, Africa isn't asking for help. It's deciding its own future. When you first hear about Burkina Faso's new rule, it sounds almost administrative. A company makes money, pays taxes, builds something. It seems routine. But this isn't just paperwork. This is about power, about place, about who gets to decide where Africa's story is written. Here's what the law actually says. If your company earns more than 5 billion CFA francs, roughly 8.8 million US dollars, you must establish your headquarters within Burkina Faso. Not a rented office in a shopping center. Not a post office box. A real headquarters built on Burkinabe soil, staffed by Burkinabe people, and rooted in the Burkinabe economy. And for the first time, the message is crystal clear. If you profit here, you belong here. It may sound like a small administrative reform, but it's much more profound. For decades, companies from every corner of the globe, gold miners from Canada, telecom giants from France, banks from Dubai, have made billions from African soil while living comfortably elsewhere. The gold leaves in trucks, the profits land in Europe, and what stays behind is dust. Burkina Faso is now saying, that era is over. From now on, if you take from our land, you build on it. It's not a protest, it's a blueprint. The simplicity of this law is what makes it powerful, because it attacks the quiet injustice that's been normalized for generations that Africa is only a place to extract from, not to build in. The government of Burkina Faso has decided that economic sovereignty begins with geographical presence. When the heart of a company, the headquarters, beats inside the country, the pulse of wealth stays local. Decisions about salaries, procurement, investments, and hiring no longer travel across oceans. They happen where the workers live. That's not just economics, that's dignity. Let's think about what happens next. When a company must build a true headquarters, it creates a ripple effect. Local architects get contracts. Construction crews find work. Cafes, taxis, and small stores spring up around new business districts. Suddenly, an abstract law becomes a living ecosystem. the money stops leaking out. The energy stays in. And that's exactly the point. Dependency waits for aid. Dignity builds its own skyscraper. Burkina Faso's leaders, under the guidance of President Ibrahim Traoré, understood something fundamental. You can't claim sovereignty if the command centers of your economy are across the sea. You can't say you're independent when your biggest investors hold their meetings in Paris. This is why the law matters so much. It's more than economics. It's psychological repair. It tells citizens you no longer have to chase opportunities abroad. The opportunities are coming home. And maybe that's why this story has struck such a deep chord across Africa and beyond. Because, for the first time in a long time, the conversation isn't about aid or pity. It's about presence and participation. In the eyes of many Africans, this is not just a national policy, it's a declaration of adulthood. A message to the world that says, we are not the continent of extraction anymore. We are the continent of creation. And while the law may sound small, its meaning is monumental. Because the moment a nation demands that those who profit from it must live within it, that nation begins to reclaim not just its money, but its mind. It didn't take long for the whispers to start. Barely a week after the law was announced, business analysts in Paris, London, and Washington began using familiar phrases: risk for investors, policy, uncertainty, a worrying precedent. The same voices that stayed silent while Africa's wealth quietly leaked away suddenly found their tongues when Africa decided to keep it. But the tone inside Africa was different. It wasn't panic, it was pride. On social media across campuses and in radio stations from Dakar to Nairobi, people began to say things they hadn't dared to say before. If Burkina Faso can do it, why can't we? That's when the world realized this was more than a local policy. It was a spark. A single act of sovereignty lighting a fire of self-respect across an entire continent. You could almost feel the unease ripple through the financial world. For decades, the architecture of global business has rested on one quiet assumption that African nations would always play by someone else's rules. Headquarters stay abroad. Profits stay abroad. Power stays abroad. Now one landlocked nation had just flipped that equation. And it did so with calm precision. There was no shouting, no anti-Western rhetoric, no US versus them. President Ibrahim Traoré and his government framed it not as rebellion, but as reason. Not an act of revenge, but of responsibility. They were saying, we are not chasing anyone away. We are simply asking you to live where you earn. And the genius of that statement is that it's morally unassailable. No serious economist can argue against it without revealing their own bias. Western media, however, tried. Headlines warned of a potential exodus of investors. Financial institutions whispered about market instability. Some foreign commentators even compared Burkina Faso's move to economic isolation. But on the streets of Ouagadougou, no one was afraid. Instead, there was a quiet sense of victory, the kind that comes when a people finally take charge of their own narrative. Young men gathered in cafes debating how the law might change the job market. Elders nodded approvingly, saying, "At last, we are keeping our wealth at home." In a time when much of the world defines power through loud displays, military, political, or digital, Burkina Faso chose a quieter kind of strength, administrative courage. And that's precisely what made the West nervous. Because when you no longer ask for permission to be sovereign, you become unpredictable and powerful. Traoré's administration understood this psychology perfectly. They anticipated the backlash and prepared for it. The law was designed with care-tiered requirements for companies of different sizes, fast-tracked permits, tax incentives for local materials. There was no chaos, no improvisation, just planning. They removed excuses before anyone could make them. The government even coordinated the Ministry of Urban Planning and the Ministry of Finance to ensure companies could build efficiently and sustainably. Every element was calculated proof that this wasn't some emotional act of nationalism, but a carefully engineered step toward economic independence. And, as the headlines in the West grew louder, the confidence inside Burkina Faso grew deeper. Because this time, the fear belonged to the outsiders. They feared losing control not of Africa's resources, but of its obedience. Burkina Faso, once dismissed as one of the world's poorest countries, had just demonstrated something wealthier nations often forget: that true power doesn't come from money. It comes from the ability to say no and mean it. Every nation dreams of building something that lasts not just walls and bridges, but confidence. And that's what began to happen the moment Burkina Faso's new law came into force. Almost overnight, the sound of hammers and engines returned to cities that had been quiet for too long. In Ouagadougou, open lots, once covered in dust, turned into construction sites. In Bobo-Dioulasso and Koudougou, scaffolding began to rise where only small warehouses once stood. This wasn't foreign aid money pouring in. This was local energy finally given direction. Architects started sketching new headquarters. Civil engineers, construction workers, and electricians were hired. Young Burkinabe graduates, once dreaming of jobs abroad, began applying for positions at home. Local suppliers, cement makers, and metal workshops saw demand skyrocket. Even the small things changed. Cafes reopened near construction zones. Street vendors sold breakfast to workers at sunrise. Taxi drivers found new routes filled with life. It felt as though the nation itself had started to breathe again. And through all of this, an invisible transformation was taking place not just in the economy, but in the hearts of the people. For years, many Africans have been taught implicitly that progress comes from elsewhere, from aid, from loans, from the kindness of the developed world. But this law told a different story. Progress begins at home. One local journalist said it best: "For the first time, we are not waiting for opportunity. We are building it." And she was right. Because when a company builds its headquarters on your land, it builds more than walls. It builds presence. It builds trust. It builds memory. Every brick becomes a declaration that says, "This nation matters." Every worker paid becomes a reminder that dignity has a price, and it's being paid in full. Burkina Faso's leadership understood that wealth isn't just measured in GDP. It's measured in how people feel about the ground they stand on. That's why this move beyond economics became a form of psychological repair. Children saw their parents wearing hard hats instead of despair. University students started believing that the future didn't have to be imported. It could be designed right here. Even the skyline began to change as new office towers reflected the rising confidence of a people once overlooked. Politically, the transformation was equally profound. The government gained credibility not through propaganda, but through visible results. Citizens could see the law's impact in concrete, glass, and steel. And when a policy turns into something you can touch, trust grows naturally. In the countryside, communities began discussing similar ideas: local cooperatives, ownership shares, community investment funds. The message had traveled beyond the capital. If we can make companies stay, we can make our wealth stay too. And that's the quiet revolution within the revolution. It's no longer about resisting the outside world. It's about redefining the inside one. Even neighboring African nations started to take notice. Delegations from Mali, Niger, and Ghana quietly visited Ouagadougou to study the implementation process. They didn't come to lecture. they came to learn. Because in a world that keeps telling Africa to wait, Burkina Faso just showed what happens when you stop waiting and start building. Dependency had been replaced by dignity, and in the soft rhythm of construction sites and new offices, the people of Burkina Faso found something they had lost for too long: the feeling that their hands, their work, and their ideas could shape the destiny of their nation. Task 5, Thunbai Fun 4, Guknyan Mai Vathajoy 402 to the Western world. It may look like just another African experiment, a daring law that will probably scare investors. But if you listen carefully, you'll realize this fear has little to do with money and everything to do with control. For more than half a century, Africa's wealth has been managed from outside its borders. Even when African nations gained political independence, the economic strings often stayed in foreign hands. Boardrooms in New York, London, or Paris decided what happened in gold mines, oil fields, and communication networks thousands of miles away. Now a new voice has entered the global conversation, calm, rational, but firm. Burkina Faso, under President Ibrahim Traoré, is saying, "We don't want your pity. We want your participation." It's a message that many Americans, especially older generations, who lived through the civil rights era, can understand. It's the same spirit that once drove their own ancestors to say, "No taxation without representation." Different century, same logic. In truth, Western investors are not afraid of instability. They have operated in riskier places. What they fear is accountability. When a company must live in the same city where it earns its profits, it can no longer hide behind distance. Its executives walk the same streets as the people whose lives their decisions affect. And that changes everything. American analysts are beginning to notice. Some quietly call Burkina Faso's approach a new model of post-colonial capitalism, a system where local ownership, fair play, and national pride are not enemies of growth, but its foundation. And for many thoughtful Americans watching this unfold, the question is not, will it work, but what took so long? Because maybe, just maybe, this small African nation has rediscovered something the world once knew: that freedom isn't truly freedom until you control the place where your wealth is made. Someday, when historians look back, they might not remember every speech or statistic, but they will remember this moment when a small, landlocked nation in West Africa quietly declared that dignity must live where wealth is made. Burkina Faso's new law is more than a policy. It's a philosophy. It tells the world that progress doesn't always come wrapped in aid packages or foreign deals. Sometimes it comes in the simple courage to say, build here, stay here, grow here. And maybe that's why this story matters far beyond Africa. Because it reminds us, whether in America, Europe, or anywhere else, that justice begins when people take responsibility for their own destiny. President Ibrahim Traoré and his government didn't raise their fists. They raised expectations. They didn't close the door to the world. They opened one to partnership built on respect, not dependence. Yes, there will be challenges ahead. Companies may resist. Critics will predict failure. The headlines might call it risky or naive. But every great movement in history began that way: dismissed, doubted, then remembered as inevitable. This is not just about buildings or business. It's about belonging. It's about a continent that once exported its gold, its oil, even its decisions, now finally choosing to export its example. A quiet revolution made of concrete courage and common sense. So tonight, ask yourself, do you believe President Ibrahim Traoré's vision can truly reshape Africa's future? Can one law, born from logic and pride, start a continental awakening? Please share this video if you feel you are among the first to understand and support President Ibrahim Traoré's movement for economic sovereignty. Subscribe if you believe that truth and dignity matter more than headlines. Because this isn't just Africa's story anymore, it's a story about all of us, about remembering that real freedom begins when we stop renting space in someone else's history and start building our own.